Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Friends of Richmond Park Zoom webinar, where we're looking at 130,000 or so remarkable trees in Richmond Park in a little more detail, and particularly how they're managed and cared for by their guardians. We're joined online today by Simon Richards, Richmond Park's manager, but sadly, due to family reasons, Gillian Jonusas, the Royal Parks Arboriculturist, is unable to join us, although you will see her on the film. This is the second in our Zoom series on Richmond Park's wildlife. Hopefully a lot of you were here for our fungi safari back in November with Janet Bostock, and that was very popular. Hopefully we can emulate that. Today we had a whopping 650 people register from Cornwall and Wales, obviously all the way to southwest London. Perhaps let us know via the questions tab if you're joining us today from somewhere even more remote or exotic. So all of you today should be members of the Friends of Richmond Park charity, but if not, don't despair, you can join us. And it's only £15 a year, and that money and all money goes towards conservation in Richmond Park, keeping the park a very special and we hope tranquil environment for its rich wildlife. And let's face it, our own physical and mental health and well-being. The park's been a godsend to many of us during this pandemic. The timetable for today, well, in a moment, Simon will set the scene about Richmond Park's trees for around about 10 minutes. After that, we'll play you a new 15-minute film, which features our new patron, the broadcaster Clare Balding. And she's interviewing Simon and Gillian in Richmond Park. Then Simon will give some more detail about the care for the park's trees, another section. And then this will be followed by a short fun film on how we're protecting some of the veteran trees in the park. And finally, it'll be your input with a Q&A session. We've already received a lot of questions, and obviously Simon's talk and the films will answer many of these, but we'll try to answer most of those questions. But you'll also have a chance to send in other questions during the presentation via a tab on your screen, which should be at the bottom. Again, we'll get to as many of these as possible, but please bear with us. So today we're also helped by Xanthi Gialusi. Xanthi Gialusi and Roger Healy are handling all the technical stuff. A very big thank you to them in advance. Before I hand over to Simon, I just wanted to read a sentence from this excellent book. I don't know if anybody has read it. It's Max Adams's The Wisdom of Trees. It's a favorite of mine. And he says, trees are marvels of nature. They are the earth's lungs, climate regulators, and habitat protectors. Ever since our prehistoric ancestors emerged from the forests of a drying Africa, trees have given us shelter, medicine, shade, food, and fuel in abundance. I think that during the pandemic, and particularly the lockdowns, we've all grown to love the local natural world, obviously very much in Richmond Park. And in particular, the trees in so many ways are the solid symbols that help us keep stable. And we're looking forward to a new season of health, hope, and happiness. But Simon, the 130,000 trees in Richmond Park, if you're there to join us, Simon, the 130,000 trees in Richmond Park, with all the pressures of the modern city life, including, of course, the pandemic, they take a lot of careful management.
Well,
Simon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard, for that introduction. Welcome to everybody who's joined today's meeting. It's great to be with so many of you today from my office at Holly Lodge. And there's a lot to talk about, really. I've got quite a condensed presentation today, but we'll come to that in a minute. But for me, those of you who don't know me, I'm Simon Richards. I'm park manager, and I've been in post since 97. And I work for the Royal Parks, who are now a charity since 2017, and we are charged with managing Richmond Park for the nation in perpetuity. And it's a huge responsibility, which I love, and always love to be able to talk about the trees, which is a particular favourite of mine in the park. So we haven't got very long. Usually I go on for an hour and a half at least on the subject of trees. I've got 2 10 to 15 minute slots. So we're going straight into the slides. And I always love to start with this image, which is a 1913 London Transport print by Charland of Richmond Park. And I think you would all probably agree that that landscape is very recognisable today. Ever since the park was enclosed, it has, you know, consistently been a deer grazed parkland with a mix of grassland and trees. So the next one, please. Thanks. So just to very, very quick overview, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the park landscape in the next 10 minutes. And just a quick overview of what trees are present in the park, and if you like, a bit of a split between the native trees that are around, as well as the many ornamental species which we also grow. In the second half, we'll expand a little bit about the veteran trees and their importance, the way in which my team and others manage the trees in the park, and then a little bit about some of the pressures that trees face in the modern era before we close and go to the questions. So we'll move straight on now to a aerial view taken a couple of years ago, and really just an opportunity to show, I think this shows as well as anything, how that park mosaic works. A mixture of closed woodlands. This is actually a view from a drone hovering above King Henry's Mound. You can see the closed woodland. You can see the vista through towards St Paul's Cathedral, which I promise you is somewhere on the distant horizon. But equally, you can see the grassland and trees scattered across the landscape. Next, please. So I wanted to dwell a little bit here about the park. So the park was enclosed by King Charles I in 1637. At that time, it was a mixture of woodland, it was farmlands and common lands, you know, which were common to half a dozen parishes, which all bound onto and inside the park. And it was almost certainly far less treed then than it is now. And these are just a few shots from our historic survey, which dates to the 1980s, which gives some indication of how tree planting has evolved over the last nearly 400 years since enclosure. And even back in 1673, so 40 years after, there's one feature shown there as the arbour. By the 1740s, after St Paul's Cathedral had been closed, you can see in again the top left-hand corner of the middle top drawing, you can see the avenue of trees that framed even then the view to St Paul's Cathedral. And you can see the Queen's Ride that leads even now to White Lodge, the home of the Royal Ballet School. As you go through the 1700s, late 1700s into the 1800s, you start to see the effects of the Victorian era plantings, where most of our major woodlands were planted that we recognise today. And you also start to see the importance of the boundary screen. As London was expanding towards the parks, so the boundary screens became ever more important. And you then come through to perhaps more recent plantings in the 20th century, many of which were ceremonial in reason, so names such as Prince Charles Spinney, Coronation Plantation, to name but a couple, and even more recently trees plantings which have been made to reflect particular events. So if we can go on to the next one, please. The archaeology of the park, the landscape which predated enclosure, can still be seen in many ways. Here you see the line of old oak trees near Holly Lodge, which mark an old field boundary. In the next one, you can see this drone shot taken on our golf course. What at first glimpse might actually look like drainage marks, in fact, are evidence of medieval ridge and furrow. This area of the park was cultivated farmland before enclosure. So there are all sorts of glimpses of that. These various eras of the park that you can see today if you look closely. So that's a little bit about the history. We'll just move on now to the key species. This little shot is from our management system. It just gives an idea of, just a snapshot of some of the trees which are present in the park. By no means all of them, but the predominant four, which I'm going to talk about now, start with oak. 50%, probably 50% of the trees in the park are oak. It is the predominant species. Then the next two or three little bits of the cheese are the other key ones, and then I'll say a little bit more about other species following that. So if we can move to the next slide, please, which I think is a tree you will all recognise. But before it got its fence and became quite so famous. The oak is a hugely important source of acorns for the deer, and the oak, together with beech, sweet chestnut and horse chestnut, have been the major trees planted in the last few hundred years, because they all provide a source of food for the deer. So the thinking was very not about ornamentation of the park, but what are the uses of these trees? And of course, oak was also used for timber. It would have been, these old pollards were cut for browse, to feed animals and provide firewood. They had many purposes at the time. So We'll talk a little bit more about acorns, I think, in the questions later. So we'll move on to the next one, which should be a rather damp picture of beech, perhaps a very locally important tree in the park, very susceptible, unfortunately, to squirrel damage. So although there's some wonderful old beech trees in the park, you'll see very many young trees which have lost branches, have lost severely damaged by squirrels. The next tree to look at then is the sweet chestnut, and I confess this is not actually a picture in Richmond Park. It's one of the veteran sweet chestnut at Greenwich Park. And just to say that sweet chestnut can grow almost as old as oak. They certainly grow faster and can be as big as oak, and they are obviously provide a huge source of food, but they are not a native, but they are naturalized in one of those trees we accept are pretty important in the landscape. And then the last one in this series is the horse chestnut, which again, a magnificent tree in the landscape, particularly when it flowers, and these days a number of problems with them, which we'll come on to, not least like the hornbeam, horse chestnut hornbeam, seem to suffer disproportionately from parakeet damage. So the smaller trees in the lands, other key trees, native trees in the landscape, are the common hawthorn, this lovely old veteran on Petersham slopes, very important components because of their when they flower in the spring, their nectar is really important to many of the invertebrates. The next one would be alder, which you see locally in the park. This is Dan's Pond Plantation, and it is a really important species around damper areas of the park. And then we'll, the next one is of willow. This is a picture of some lovely old crack willows, which are situated to the north of Holly Lodge, which have grown and collapsed and layered. And there are a variety of willows in the park. And other natives which are important are hornbeam, lime, elm, cherry, poplar, which are seen around the park. We'll now just move on briefly to talk about the ornamental trees in the park, mostly concentrated in the gardens at Isabella and Pembroke Lodge, and we hold some really quite important collections of ornamental trees. Particularly maples, the acers, birch, magnolia, trees like that. Also many unusual conifers, the dawn redwood and pine, which you see in this picture. They're not uniquely in the gardens, and some are, nevertheless, you will see as you go around the park, there are other ornamental trees such as the cedars in Petersham Park, sequoia opposite Pembroke Lodge, monkey puzzles here and there. So they are to be found in the wider park, and they are flagged up very well in the Friends excellent series of tree leaflets which were published last year. And then just to say, really, trees are planted for many reasons. Obviously for the biodiversity benefits, but also in the garden areas, they have all sorts of other wonderful attributes, be it here the bark colour which you see on Himalayan birch, or flowering such as these magnolias again in the Isabella plantation. So there's always something out there of interest. I think to keep anyone who's looking around interested in any part of Richmond Park. And I'll hand back to Richard at this point. That's it. Yeah.
Lovely. Okay. Well, thank you, Simon. And hopefully everybody can hear me a bit more clearly now. I understand there were some audio problems before. Thank you, Simon, for that. In a minute, we'll play the Clare Balding film. But first, I've just got a couple of questions for you, Simon, or clarifications. You mentioned parakeet damage. What sort of things do they do with parakeets? They spend a lot of time stripping the shoots out of trees. If you go for even now in the middle of winter, you'll already start to, if you go around horse chestnuts in the park, you will see the leading shoots. The flower buds have been plucked out by the parakeets and discarded. And it's similar in the summer when the trees are fruiting. So beech mast and hornbeam seed, they seem to be very partial to, and they cause as they strip those shoots out, they tend to take out the leading buds of the trees as well. So if you look at young horse chestnut trees in the park now, you'll see they're very short. The shoots are very short and stubby. So they're not really allowed to put on proper extension growth. So the trees are effectively becoming dwarfed by them. Okay. I'll put one question to you here that I received in advance. We received in advance. It's from Mr. A, no first name, Mr. A. Contreras. He asks, I'm curious about the many planted oaks in a 5-tree cross pattern. Can you explain this and why?
Yes, this actually refers back to, I mentioned ceremonial plantings, and invariably many of these in Richmond Park were to commemorate royal occasions. And that particular group, which is a group of 25 trees planted in a diamond pattern on the northern edge of Lawn Plantation, was planted to commemorate the Jubilee of King George V. Oh, right. And that was a plant, that was a planting.
Right.
And
Okay.
the park manager, the park superintendent at the time, presumably exercises discretion in what form or shape that planting took. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Simon. Well, we'll come back to you in a moment for the second half of your presentation. That first half was fascinating. The second half is going to be more about more challenges of disease and so on. So let's have a look now at the film. I'll give a little introduction to this first. We're delighted that Clare Balding was keen to join us as a patron of the charity very recently, back in November. As you know, she's a much loved and familiar face on TV and a well-known voice on radio, and is a very successful children's author too. And she loves Richmond Park, lives locally. She's been coming to the park for many, many years. So we thought, well, we'd put her interviewing skills to the test, particularly her skills on the knowledge of trees. And she joined us in Richmond Park back in early December on a cold, grey day by a well-known tree. So can we have the film, please, now?
This is the Year of the Tree in Richmond Park, and it's been pioneered by the conservation charity Friends of Richmond Park. The symbol for it is this magnificent veteran royal oak, and we're going to be talking about that more in a moment. But joining me, Simon Richards, the parks manager, and Gillian Jonusas, an arboriculturist for the Royal Parks. I am allowed to just say tree officer. It's a good word, that, though. Simon, what are we managing here in terms of numbers, and how do you achieve it?
So Royal Parks manage, we think, around about 130,000 trees in Richmond Park, 2,500 acres. It's the biggest estate, in London. That's made up of all sorts of things, largely the oak, the beech, the sweet chestnut and the horse chestnut, which were originally planted to provide feed to the deer. So always remembering this is a deer park. And then lots of smaller trees, birch and alder, hawthorn, the pollinators, which we see around us. So there's a lot of small trees, but still an incredible number of big old trees in the park as well. So it's a huge undertaking, and obviously our job is to do all this with public safety in mind and for conservation reasons, to protect not only the trees themselves, but all the populations that rely on trees and the wider sort of benefits that trees bring to society.
Gillian, talking about that wider benefit, what do generally trees mean to you, and specifically this royal oak?
Well, the royal oak is a lovely example of all the big old trees that we've got in the park. It's a fantastic habitat. If you look at the tree itself, you can see all the hollowing of the trunk and the cracks and seams and nest holes, which is excellent for wildlife. But it's also an amazing symbol of resilience. It's been here for literally hundreds of years. The history and the culture and everything that it's seen, and it's particularly at this time when there are lots of other things going on, it's a real symbol of strength, and it's really magical. I think it's a lovely old tree.
They have a thing in Japan actually that they diagnose, that doctors prescribe, I should say, because it is so good for you to be out and about. And I think particularly in the winter months, being able to see the branches and the delicate nature of them, I find that really powerful.
And ever changing as well, really, and reacting to the seasons and all the different colours, and going into dormancy and then coming alive again in the spring. It's a very positive way of looking at things. So. Yeah.
And it's what makes this park so special. And Simon, I always find it remarkable, here we are on the outskirts of London with such a vast population, and yet you can come here and feel as if you're on the Yorkshire Moors.
Yeah, you can. And I mean, you look back in history, and when this was a country estate sort of 8 miles outside of London, it's only the last 100 years or so that London's crept out and encircled the park, and yet it's still maintains an element of that sort of rural quality. So it's fascinating.
Trees, like humans, are susceptible to viruses and diseases, and there have been a couple of pretty serious ones in recent years.
Well, in the country as a whole, things like Dutch elm disease wiped out virtually the whole population of elms in the country from the sort of late 1960s onwards. And that wasn't just a huge loss in the landscape, but also the loss of habitat for the species-dependent wildlife. And ash dieback, which people might be more aware of because it first came to people's attention in about 2012, that's now affecting ash, another fungal disease affecting ash across the country. So it's not likely to affect Richmond Park so much, in that we have ash trees, but not a huge number of them. So the loss of individual trees, although it would be very sad and a big loss, it's not going to have the landscape effect that it might have in other parts of the country. So there are other pests and disease which we manage very proactively in the park. Horse chestnut bleeding canker, which is not the horse chestnut leaf miner that causes all the leaves to go brown and drop off, which people are probably more familiar with. The bleeding canker is more serious and can cause decline and death. Acute oak decline, which affects hundreds of oak in the park actually. That's a sort of general decline syndrome, which we manage very proactively. And there's a number of other things on the horizon.
I'm a very keen golfer, so actually one of the diseases I've become very aware of is processionary moth. How do you diagnose that, and how are you treating it?
It's actually a very invasive tree pest, and we've been managing it in the park since 2009, and we diagnose it, if you like. We have a group of fantastic volunteer surveyors who go out in June and July and look for caterpillar nests in the trees and collect lots of data. And once we know where all the nests are, we can send out the tree teams in their hazmat suits, which look like spacemen really. And because the caterpillars cause a very nasty skin rash and itchy eyes and breathing difficulties and things, it's very important that only people in full PPE remove them. So that's quite a massive logistical exercise, but it's been very successful in keeping the population of OPM within sort of manageable levels. So, yeah.
How big a team have you got, Simon, working on the trees?
So it varies seasonally, but I mean, there's probably not a week goes by in the year when we don't have a tree team working here doing something, so be it winter pruning or safety work. But they're a team of contractors. I think last week we had 3 separate teams working in the park, so there's so much different sorts of work that need to be done, and then some of it's seasonal. The oak processionary moth sort of takes over July and August really, sort of removing all the nests from the trees. And then clearing up after storms. We had, this year's been very notable in the summer months. We had several very windy weekends, quite a lot of damage, several trees collapsed and things like that. So there's always, a reactive element to what we do, as well as the sort of more long-term planning for the conservation end of it. So it's very varied.
And planting, I assume. How many trees do you plant every year?
I think probably people will be surprised because we probably plant around 50 to 100 large trees on average. So trees which you recognise are big enough they sit in a crate to protect them from the deer being eaten. But then on top of that we plant an awful lot of numbers of what we would call whips, so small hedging, more like hedging plants, which you plant very densely in woodlands and shelter belts and screens, and then obviously they all have to be established. So the numbers are a tricky thing, but tree planting, it's partly about, it isn't really about numbers, it's actually about establishing. So for every tree you plant, you've got to water it and you've got to prune it. Eventually you have to thin them out. So it's all about bringing them through, because we've always said one of the great things about my job is very few jobs in life where you're actually managing assets which are 500 or 600 years old, and you're planning for how does that tree you're planting this year get to be a tree like that in 500 years time. That's our legacy, and that's the fascinating part of what we do. So you've got almost a millennium time span that you're dealing with in your thinking. So where we plant trees, what we plant, and then of course having to think about what climate change is going to do to what species we'll be able to plant and what will survive in the future, all has to form part of our thinking.
This Royal Oak, is it veteran or is it an ancient tree? And Gillian, what's the difference?
I would say that this tree is probably bordering between veteran and ancient. So veteran trees are trees with very specific sort of characteristics, like a hollowing trunk like this one, lots of decay cavities, loose bark, rot holes, nest holes, all sorts of things which trees usually develop as they get very old. So a veteran tree is normally old, but a tree can also be damaged by high winds or lightning strikes or even animal damage and develop those characteristics. So they have veteran characteristics even though they're not very old. An ancient tree is a tree which is very old for its species, but an ancient oak tree could be anything from sort of 700 to 1,000 years old. They get very, very old.
This one does look, I think, particularly full of character. And it's if it was a person, you'd say it's quite squat,
Yes.
and strong, low centre of gravity.
Yes, very sturdy.
Very sturdy, yes. I think it's a solid person.
Yes.
And it's got actually very good skin. You know, it's wrinkled, but it's not.
It's not. No, there's no signs of sort of necrosis or disease or anything like that. So it's got some fantastic moss and lichen and things growing on it as well because it's very old. So the reason it's become like that shape is because it was basically, when it was small, it was not what we'd call a working tree. So historically, trees were managed by pollarding, which basically means cutting all the branches off about 2 or 3 meters above the browse height of the deer, and all that branch material that was cut off was used for firewood or feeding livestock, or sometimes fencing materials, and sometimes, if they were very big, even sort of building planks, and sometimes even shipbuilding. But while that was going on and keeping the crown very small, the trunk just gets bigger and bigger and bigger as it grows. So although the tree gets very big and wide, the crown is small. And so it becomes much less susceptible to wind damage and that sort of thing. So it becomes very squat and sturdy, and it's got the characteristic sort of contorted, twisting branches of English oak. But it means that pollards often lived much longer than trees which weren't pollarded. And that's one reason why we've got so many veteran and trees in the park, because they were all pollarded many hundreds of years ago.
This oak is protected by beautiful fencing, I must say. It's really lovely. And there's a lot of it in the park. Why have you done that?
Increasingly, what we found, because these trees are, I wouldn't say unique, but they are incredibly rare to have trees this age in a public park. And people, you see the above ground part of the tree, you don't always understand what's going on below the ground and the roots of trees, which are very susceptible to trampling. And as the park has got busier over the years, increasingly we found people, it's all that we love to, commune and hug trees, don't we? All do it. But with these old trees, actually, that love can also cause damage. So the fencing's here for 2 reasons. They're very fragile, these old trees, and there's a real issue because you don't want to intervene with them. If you have to intervene with them, it can, do damage to the tree, and you don't want that to happen. So it's trying to balance that fragility with protecting the trees and allowing them to sort of continue to thrive, and the fungal communities that live on the roots. So by fencing, if the tree's fragile and it sheds a limb, then it's going to shed it into an area where hopefully there's not going to be anybody underneath. And the fencing obviously just allows the soil ecology to re-establish, the worms to do their stuff, and hopefully that that's what sustains, in large part what sustains the trees going forwards.
So if you're coming in here for a picnic, don't go through the fence and because that is protecting the roots, not just the tree.
So we would say, lean on the fence, have a look at it. There's plenty of other trees you can do that too in the park, but these ones, they are, yes, we've got around about just over 1,000 veteran trees in the park, but we're probably one of the top 5 sites of veteran trees in the UK. So they are precious, they're rarer than listed buildings, so we've got a job to look after them. That's our duty.
How important are the trees here to the wildlife in the park?
Well, I think it's fairly well known that oak, trees probably sustain 1,000 species, other things that rely on it. So, they're really important. We've got colonies of bats, quite rare bats in the park. There's several trees just around here, which where we know they breed and hibernate. So they're at sort of mammal level. They're obviously originally they were planted for the deer, so they're very important at that level. Their home, as you can hear the parakeets in the background, very important as a nest sites for birds. But then the less obvious things are what we call saproxyltic invertebrates. All the beetles, which rely on trees for part or all of their life cycles. They feed on the dead wood, the roots, and in the trunks, all that softwood in the centres of the trees. So they are absolutely fundamental directly for hundreds, if not thousands, of species survival. But then indirectly, of course, trees, their role in climate change, providing shade, cooling the temperature, cleaning the air for us. So they are incredibly, so indirectly that affects all species on Earth. So, there's directly and indirectly they are so important.
I hope you enjoyed that film. Claire, as you could see, was very enthusiastic about the film, and she was immensely cooperative and creative in making the film. So thank you very much to Claire for doing that for us. Simon, before we get to the second half of your presentation, I'd like to put this question to you, if that's all right. It's from Stephen Reed, and looking at just so many of those wonderful tempting trees, Stephen Reed asks, what is the Royal Parks position on allowing visitors to climb trees? Many of us nurtured a love and respect for trees through climbing them as children. So do you have a policy on that, Simon?
Yeah, I don't know. It goes as far as saying we have a policy. Stephen is quite right. I grew up lurking in woodlands as well. I think the issue we have with tree climbing in Richmond Park is the fragility, particularly of the old trees. And whilst it's something we love to do as children, it's quite often this woodland which we perhaps grew up in and used didn't contain the veteran trees that we have in Richmond Park. So I wouldn't want to be the person that said don't ever climb a tree in Richmond Park, but I would caution people and say, if you're going to climb a tree, think twice about it, but really do not go and climb in a veteran tree, because many of them are hollow. We've seen people inside the trees. Well, those trees are living entities, and every time you climb into a tree, some beetle is being disturbed. You're actually causing harm to someone else, another species home. So I'd be cautious. We're never going to go out there and start fining people, I suppose, but I would urge people perhaps not to go and climb on the biggest, oldest trees, because they are fragile and they're unique and precious.
Mm. Yes, and I think that's one of the reasons that we make these films, is to and have these Zoom presentations, is to hopefully give people the reason why these either policies or protections are put in place in the park, indeed like the fencing. But we'll talk more about that in the second half of your presentation, Simon. So here we go, Simon. Let's hand over to you for the second half.
Firstly, just commend the film, the editing of the film, which I thought absolutely brilliant. Well, apart from my presence in it anyway. I just want to expand a little bit more about the importance of veteran trees in the park. And we quite often use the image of this tree, which many of you will recognise as the tree that stands on the field outside Holly Lodge. By girth, it's the second biggest tree in the park, therefore probably one of the oldest, if not the oldest. And it's a magnificent tree, but it's a really good example of how an open grown oak will form. So it's an oak tree characteristically will be very, probably at least as broad, as wide as it is tall. And whereas trees grown in woodlands tend to be taller and narrower. So the form of a tree does very much depend on where it grows in the park. And as was said in the film, the reason for the longevity of so many of our veteran oaks is because they were pollarded, they were worked, they had a purpose for many, many years. So if we go to the next slide, please. In the film, Gillian mentioned some of the attributes that veteran trees have, and I just wanted to perhaps say a little bit more about those. And it's something which we, when we're looking at trees around the park, it is something which we really want to try and capture their importance for wildlife. So the presence of dead wood in trees, holes in them, fungi on them, the plants which grow on them. Many of our trees, increasingly, we're starting to see more lichens grow in the park than perhaps have done for many years as London's atmosphere is cleaned up. And so there are all sorts of good things which make a tree recognisable as a veteran. And I hope you've all worked out the difference now between a veteran tree and an ancient tree. So the features of veteran trees can start to form at a very young age. So next one, please. And I think perhaps characteristic of veteran trees is this shape. This is a sort of gnarly, quite small beech tree in, I think this was in the Isabella plantation, and it just goes to show how trees can form these really interesting shapes, but nevertheless you can see mosses growing on the tree, you can start to see the cavities forming, and it's really important to realise that it isn't just about the importance of a tree is not linked to its direct size. Next, please. So you've seen this one before, but this hawthorn is a really good example of an old hawthorn tree. They probably in this park grow to around perhaps 200 years, that order of magnitude. Elsewhere in the country they can live for longer, but again a small tree, incredibly important components allied to the oak and the invertebrates that live on oak, and how we associate those the two trees together. Over the years we've probably lost a lot. There would have been more hawthorn in the park than there currently is, so you'll see in a minute it's something that's very much part of our current thinking, how we up the numbers. So next, please. And there's an interesting debate about how old is a tree. So some of you will recognise this lime tree, which is down in Petersham Park. You can just see the Elm Avenue on the right hand side there. This is a tree that probably 150, 200-year-old tree that blew over in the 1987 hurricane. But it stayed alive, and you can see how the branches which were in contact with the ground are effectively forming new elements, new trees. And you might say, so when the main trunk eventually rots away, you have a collection of freestanding lime trees. Are they 233 years old, or are they 33 years old? You know, genetically, they're 233 years old. So it highlights, if you like, survival strategies in the wild. Trees have. They grow, they fall over, they regrow. So trees can be a lot older than they actually may at first appear. So we'll just skip through the next ones quickly. Again, it was mentioned in the film, the importance of veteran trees. The features, the cavities, of course, are home to many, many species, be it mammals, the rabbits that live underneath trees, badgers which are near trees, this very rare Leisler's bat, which again will nest in cavities and under bark flaps in trees. So really important to a range of mammals and birds, and also to a whole variety of fungi. Now, these fungi you will all know about from Janet's talk before Christmas, but very important. They mostly live in harmony with the tree. And for many years, you know, they some of them will cause no problems whatsoever. But it is important for us to recognise that certain fungi, and these are actually some of them, which are the ones which cause stem and root rot, can affect the stability of the trees, and that's where it's really important that where the management, if you like, comes in. Next, please. We mentioned the stag beetle. That is very much our flagship species, the reason why the park was designated as a special area of conservation. But actually, it's the flagship for a whole range of beetles in particular, which exist on dead wood, saproxylic beetles, and they are why it is so important, actually, that trees and the dead wood on them is left alone wherever possible. And den building in the park, which again we all see, every time someone builds a den, you might be creating a home for your child, but you've just destroyed the home from, you know, you may have destroyed the home for some rare beetle. So we do need to try and get that message across that den building, actually, it might be great fun, but it isn't actually a very good thing for the invertebrates. And of course, the park is charged, you know, our special scientific interest designation is in large part about protecting the rare saproxylic deadwood living beetles which exist in the park. So very important to us. Next, please. So why do we have to actively manage trees? And really, this is down to the reality that we are managing a hugely busy landscape. The park, we know, was probably 5.5 million visitors a year the last time we counted them in 2014. It wouldn't surprise me actually currently if we doubled that this year, because we all know how incredibly busy the park has been. And yet we have a park full of natural organisms. Trees are natural living organisms. They're not like a motorway bridge, which can be surveyed, you know, structurally analysed and pretty much guaranteed not to fall down. Trees, on the other hand, do fall down, and that can be a huge challenge. As the landowner, we have a duty, obviously, to look after the safety of our visiting public. When big limbs crash out like this or big trees fall over, that can and does present a risk. And sometimes we have to intervene quite quickly. So if a tree perhaps comes across a road or whatever, it's we have to sort of do speedy intervention. And as I mentioned in the film, there's almost always a tree team working in the park somewhere. So we are able to react quickly to situations like this. Okay, so Gillian's role very much on the next slide is to survey our trees. This is just a very quick snapshot from our internal tree management system. And we manage basically the park is divided into a series of risk zones. So where are the public most likely to be? And obviously that will be around car parks, roads, buildings. And so we put proportionally more effort into surveying trees in busy areas than we do in the wider areas of the park, or indeed non-public areas such as Sidmouth Wood. If a tree in Sidmouth Wood collapses, there are no human consequences. A tree collapses in a car park, there may be. Overall, the risk from trees is incredibly low. When you look at national statistics, it's a vanishingly small risk, but nevertheless it is a real risk which we have to look after. Okay, we probably survey currently perhaps around 10% of the trees in the park are actually individually recorded. Many more are surveyed at a distance just by us walking through areas of woodland. One difference is the veteran trees, which are, you will maybe have seen these little oval tags attached to old trees. They are all individually recorded, and we do carry a lot more data on our veteran trees because they are so special. If we go on to the next one, please. So maintenance, really, it is costly. We spend a lot of time and a good proportion of the Royal Parks budget maintaining trees across our estates. And when you're dealing particularly with old, fragile veteran trees, quite often you can't climb them because that would be too risky for the tree surgeon. So we have to bring in equipment like this working platform, which we need particularly where we're working on slopes. So that is costly. So we do that, and then the next slide shows the reason that the first thing we have to do to an old tree like this is actually check what's living in it. So you can see the fissure in that tree. So that guy's up a tree with an endoscope looking inside the cracks, looking for bats and birds or whatever might be up there. So a lot of our tree work has to be done seasonally, but if we find evidence of bats in a tree, then we stop work. We'll have to come back another time and do it. We may then have to fence the tree off if we think there's an imminent danger, but whatever, we've already expended quite a lot of money. So it's tree work is necessary and really it's constantly going on. The general idea with our tree work is to do as little as possible. The less you can actually intervene in a tree, the better. This is just an example of some pruning work done to a veteran tree near Holly Lodge, and you may just be able to see on the outer edge of the crown how the shoots have been pruned back. So we're just trying to take some of the weight off the end of the shoots rather than go cut deeply into the crown. So generally as little as possible, or preferably none, but inevitably, because it's a public park, you have to do some work. Okay, we can skip past Oak Processionary Moth very quickly, other than just to say it is again costly. This is Oak Processionary Moth first was found in Richmond Park in 2009. We mentioned in the film, we have a whole army of wonderful volunteers that go out and look for it. At the end of the day, we have to expend a lot of money. This guy is actually hoovering low caterpillars out of a tree where we think there'd be a real risk of the public coming into contact with the caterpillars. So not only do we remove nests later in the season, we remove caterpillars during this sort of season when they're crawling around the trees. All of that debris has to be collected and incinerated because it is seriously horrible stuff to handle, and there's a cost to doing that. So to the next one, please. And again, I'll just mention acute oak decline here, which was mentioned in the film, and the next slide, which shows horse chestnut bleeding canker. The consequences of this, it may or may not kill the tree. Sometimes a tree will succumb very quickly to a disease. Sometimes it will linger for many years. Quite often in our landscape, you'll see standing dead trees. Now, whereas we know a dead oak tree will actually stay upright for several years, and the longer we can leave them standing, the better it is for birds like woodpeckers that will nest in them. Trees like horse chestnuts actually disintegrate very, very quickly. So where a horse chestnut dies, we will almost certainly fell it within a year or two because they are very quickly become unstable. But amazing habitat, particularly for things like lesser stag beetles. So we have to be very careful on what we leave and how we manage different trees as a result of various pests and diseases which affect them. Next, please. Okay, so just a little bit more about planting. We mentioned roughly how many trees we plant every year, and which sort of answers the numbers game. On the right, you can see what happens when particularly thin bark trees like beech and lime, if the deer get stuck into them, they can very quickly cause damage. So tree crates, as you see on the left, any young tree which is planted in open parkland, if it isn't protected for 40 to 50 years until the bark is thick enough, the deer, particularly in August when they're fraying their antlers, can very quickly do a lot of damage to trees. So the tree crates do protect them well from the deer. Less well, offer no protection, unfortunately, from squirrels, but there you go. Next, please. So the veteran tree, the fencing which you've seen, which has been a programme which has been very, very well and very graciously supported by the Friends, is where we're using now, where we think a tree has the prospect, an old tree has the prospect of good long life. We know this tree is fragile. We know it could possibly shed a limb. So rather than do surgery in this case, we would rather fence the tree off. So if that tree does shed a limb, it will fall inside the fence line, and the chance of it hurting anybody is very, very small indeed. You can also see in this picture that the base of the tree has got wood chip around it, and particularly because of trampling around root zones of trees, we are concerned about the rooting environment. You see the damage to tree roots is generally unseen, but of course you do see it ultimately because the aerial parts of the tree suffer, and you see increasing dieback in the crown of the tree. So by protecting the tree with fencing, you're not only keeping people safe, you are protecting the root zone of the tree. And mulch, there's good evidence that shows that bark mulch does help the root zone to recover and will over time improve the health of the tree. Next, please. Other conservation measures, we don't always have to plant trees. Some develop naturally from seedlings, so simply by removing grazing pressure, by fencing out the deer, we can allow particularly hawthorn. You'll see a lot of fencing around in places in the park where we've just fenced off hawthorn seedlings and we're letting them grow through on their own roots. All we have to do is protect them. We don't need to stake them. We don't need to water them. So very cost-effective way of getting trees back in the landscape. And the next one, please. Elsewhere, this is a picture of a black poplar, one of Britain's rarest trees. We're lucky enough to have 4 veteran black poplars, all situated along the sort of northern boundary between in the Boggate, Roehampton Gate area. And our role really to conserve rare trees. So here for many years now, we've been taking cuttings of these trees, we've been propagating them, we grow them on, we plant them back out in the park, but we also distribute young trees to other landowners. So a lot of our trees are now to be found growing along the riverside and further afield. So conservation of a wide range of old trees is really important to us. And the other one, which I was just going to mention briefly, last year we planted a large number of fruit trees, again with Friends support around the park, because we recognise the importance of nectar sources, but also fruit gives another potential food for the deer in the late summer and autumn. So again, lots of good reasons to plant trees. Next, please. Okay, a little bit about, we introduced the sort of concept of human issues around human impacts. We've mentioned trampling, we've mentioned den building, we've mentioned tree climbing now, and probably this last one is another one which is always I really don't like, when people discard disposable barbecues into cavities in trees and set fire to them. It doesn't always kill the tree, it certainly did in this case, and it's really why we're all talking today, how do we get messages across to people how important the trees are. you know, in the landscape, you know, the human benefits of trees, the wider benefits to biodiversity that trees give. Next, please. Where we get, just the last couple now, just to say, where we do get the opportunity to harvest timber, we do so, and that manifests itself built back into tree crates, benches, and things like that. So we use timber where we can. Recycling timber within the park is always a good thing if you can do it. Next. Lastly, just to finish up some of the other work we do, we work with a wide range of research organisations such as Forest Research, but we also, the park contains not only lots and lots of veteran trees, but this is a little veteran thorn. It's an ornamental tree which grows inside Pembroke Lodge, and it was Britain's largest example of this particular species, Crataegus flabellata, a few years ago. Unfortunately, it fell over not so long ago, but nevertheless, it is still growing from the shoots at the bottom. So some of our champion trees are mentioned in the tree leaflets. And again, if you're interested in trees, the Tree Register of the British Isles is a really good organisation to go and have a look at, obviously online. And lastly, then, just to say thank you very much for listening to me, and to say this is your tree. The Friends Oak was planted by Richmond Roundabout about 20 years ago. It's growing really, really well, and I like to think it's a really good symbol of the relationship, the positive relationship which the Royal Parks have had for many, many years now with the Friends of Richmond Park. And I'd like to thank you all for the ongoing support that you give to us, by volunteering, by all the conservation work that takes place in the park, but and also by funding the programme, various conservation programmes which are ongoing in the park. So I'll call a halt there. Thank you.
Right, I should be back with you again. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you for that. That was very enlightening, and I'm sure your presentation will have answered many of the questions that people have previously sent in or sent in during your presentation, but also raised more questions. And indeed, we've got quite a few rolling in. But before we get to the final Q&A session, Simon talked about the value of the veterans of the trees. We've touched on it a few times today. We talked about the chestnut fencing around the veterans, and the Royal Oak in particular, we know has chestnut fencing protecting it. And so we thought it would be fun to make a short film about how the fences are installed, and the sort of craftsmanship that's involved in doing it. They've used no screws or glue, which I think is very impressive. And these guys managed to install the fences, or in this instance, in less than 2 minutes, which is remarkable. But of course, there is a bit of a video trick to that. And there's no speaking in this short video, but there is some rather lovely, familiar music. So turn up your volume, sit back and watch some true craftsmen erect protective fencing around a lovely big oak tree very quickly. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. As you can see, I'm not Nicholas Parsons, but that was the Minute Waltz, Chopin's Minute Waltz, and it was very enjoyable. And so we get to, and I hope you really enjoyed the film. So Simon, we now back to you. You're on the spot now, I'm afraid. It's question time.
Okay.
I've got the whole load of questions here for you. I'll go through a few that we received in advance, if that's okay. And here we go. So they'll be put to you pretty quickly. First of all, one of the questions I'd like to put to you, Sarah Travers, and Sarah's asked a question that few people have asked, which is how do you ascertain the age of a lot of, particularly the older trees in the park? How do you do that?
Really by reference to work that's been undertaken in perhaps the last 20 or 30 years by groups like the Ancient Tree Forum. Obviously the really old trees are hollow, so you can't do a ring count. So in oak terms, the trees are generally estimated to grow at around a metre of girth per 100 years. We don't have planting dates from any of the veteran trees in the park. They were all here before the park was enclosed. You know, they were probably mostly 200, maybe 150, 200 years old already by the time the enclosure took place. So we can't do it from, very rarely can we do it from a planting date, but there are examples in the states across the country where planting dates are known. So we reckon it's about, in oak terms, it's about a metre per 100 years, and on the basis of that, our biggest tree is around 7.3 metres in girth. That's an old oak that stands in high wood. The second is the one on Holly Lodge Lawn. So that dates them at around perhaps 700 or so years old. The Royal Oak, based on girth, is number 9 on our list, and probably around about 550 to 600 years old. But you know, there, as we say, the size that isn't everything, but it is always nice to sort of know where the biggest of everything is, isn't it?
Absolutely, thank you for that. Karen Brown also, she's asked a question which also a few other people have asked, which was about the glut of acorns this year in the park. And just a very quick story on this. When we made the David Attenborough film a few years ago, when we went to film him with a handful of acorns in the park, when we got there in November, there were no acorns. So we couldn't find any. So do you know why there are gluts of acorns in certain years and not in others?
Yeah, it's generally acorn production is cyclical. You'll have a good year. And it's not just acorns, the same apply to beech and other species. Some years are better than others. I think this year particularly, we went from having a very damp winter through to a very warm summer. So conditions in the spring, when the oak trees flowered and set their acorns, were very favourable. And what we tend to find is if you have a real glut, as we've had this year, obviously, as soon as they're down on ground, the deer start hoovering them up, which is why you quite often don't find very many in November, particularly in a year where there hasn't been such a heavy production. But the tree does put a lot of energy into producing acorns, so it's generally accepted if you have it takes a year or two then for the tree to recover its energy, so you will not get, even with favourable weather, you will not get heavy acorn production every year. So it's a cyclical thing. It's a bit of climate.
Right. Thank you. The Dominic Sheldon asks, how do you get the balance between native and non-native trees in the park? I mean, obviously you've got the Isabella, which is about exotics and so on, but how do you get the balance elsewhere?
That's really a question about our tree planting strategies now. In the past, the fact that we've got trees like monkey puzzles growing out in the park, you might think, well, why did that end up there? And there's probably always in time people have had surplus trees sitting in a nursery somewhere, and well, let's go and plant that out in the park. But yeah, for the vast bulk of the park, the focus is on the key one, the four key, the four key trees which we mentioned earlier because of their productivity for the deer. The ornamental plantings in Pembroke Lodge go back a lot longer than the ornamental plantings in Isabella Plantation. And in the Isabella Plantation, you can see the different layers. There are very old veteran trees in there. There are the Sidmouth Victorian era plantings, and then the ornamental plantings, which have gone in since the 1950s. So now we would be far less likely to plant ornamental trees out in the wider parkland than perhaps we would have done 50 years ago. But you look across the park landscape, the importance in the landscape of red oaks, the American oaks, which are quite a lot, which give all the lovely autumn colour. Yeah. They're not native. They still support a huge number of invertebrates. So we're not ever going to be in a position where we say, well, that's a non-native, get rid of it. They all contribute in different ways, and with emerging climate change, we've mentioned threats to several of our key tree species already. So diversifying, so planting more black poplar, so trying to widen the range of native trees in the park is certainly part of our thinking at the moment.
Kathy White wrote in, I think she sent in an email as well. She's drawn a particular oak tree in the park herself, a bit in the style of this drawing here, which I've seen her drawing. It's very, very beautiful, Kathy. She's based it on the old oak tree near Adams Pond that's fenced off. Do you have anything on the history or age of that one? Do you know that one at all?
I'm afraid not. It's not. It's like many of them. We do not know when it was planted. Right. Other than a long time ago, it's certainly big enough to be classed as a veteran. Yes. It's probably around 500 years old. It's just a lovely, characterful tree.
It is.
And
it's a lovely tree.
You can apply that to any number, but there is very few. The only tree really which is named is John Martin's oak, which is the huge oak that sits just near the road south of Pembroke Lodge, and that's its association with the poet, and the fact that tree was painted and can be found in the V&A collection. So, but we don't know its planting date. It's just an association, rather like there is no basis in fact for calling the Royal Oak the Royal Oak. Yeah, trees. There is a cultural association over the years, and trees acquire names, which is great.
Yeah. A lot of people have written and talked about the damage in the park at the moment due to high visitor numbers, and a combination of that with social distancing and the mud and wet. Obviously, the park's very, very wet at the moment, particularly the lower end of the park, extremely boggy and wet. And somebody, Kath Brooks, was also pointing out that Beverley Brook near Roehampton Gate is taking a bit of a pounding. The tree element of this was that she was concerned that the banks were taking a pounding from just sheer numbers of people. Would that be undermining the lovely old willows, the pollarded willows that are there, that we saw in the film, actually?
There is no doubt, it's plainly evident that there are huge numbers of people tramping around the park at the moment, and I'm afraid that is just something we've got to accept in the short term. The long-term consequences of that worry me, if I'm honest. And I think there will be a lot of work done, to recover the tree population. Some of the damage is probably more significant to grassland as it is to the trees. The amount of anthill trampling that's going on is severe. The trees, there was someone asked the question about whether trees move sideways, and we talked about this, and I thought, well, that's a strange question. And then actually I thought, Well, actually, they do, because exactly those trees on the Beverley Brook, over the years, they do erosion. The Beverley Brook was straightened in the 1920s and sort of turned into a bit of a deep canal. Trees were planted on the tops of the banks, and over the years, actually, erosion, bank erosion, both by river flooding, by deer, and by people, have broken the banks down, and the trees do gradually slide down the banks and they may fall over. So I can't say that trees don't move. I can't say that, but I can't say that human pressure alone is causing all the damage, because there are other factors.
Okay. You talked a bit about parakeets. For a lot of the bird fanciers in the park, not their favourite bird. And obviously we've heard nationally that there may be some action to do on culling and so on. But I was particularly, you mentioned it earlier about squirrel damage, grey squirrel damage in the park on trees in particular. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit more?
Squirrel damage in particular, it's very, very noticeable. Used to be mostly associated with, as I mentioned earlier, beech and hornbeam, but increasingly we've noticed squirrel damage on young oaks. If you take a walk around Two Storm Wood, now you'll see a huge amount of squirrel damage on all the trees in there. And they eat around the branch collar particularly, which dies, and then it just kills the branch and the tree collapses. So it can be really, really severe. And the problem with all of these things is, how do you control them? So we do a limited amount of squirrel control in places like the Isabella Plantation, where they can wreak havoc with the rare ornamental collections. Our options are less viable in the wider parkland, and the problem with things like any invasive pest, I could say I'll go and shoot every parakeet and every squirrel, we'll close the park for a day, shoot the lot. Great, they've all gone, end of problem. Of course not, because the following day they'll either fly or walk back in. So the only way, unless there is concerted action by government to tackle the parakeets, they're here to stay. There is a lot of research being put into whether they can develop a contraceptive for grey squirrel. And I think that's some very interesting work, because if that was the case, then we may well be able to get a sort of not effectively non-lethal but very effective control over the squirrel population. They really do cause huge damage here. Nationally, the damage they cause to forestry runs to millions and millions of pounds annually. So real problem across the country.
Absolutely. Ian Patterson asks, will you be pollarding? You two talked about the sort of pollarded oaks in the park and how important they are for wildlife later on as they get old and get cavities in them and so on. Will you be pollarding younger oaks to create future ancient trees?
Absolutely, we can and we do. And we've been pollarding young oaks for the best part of 20 years now. We actually started a programme for the Queen's Golden Jubilee, I think in 2002. So you will see going around the park a number of, not only oak, it wasn't only oak that were pollarded, many trees were pollarded. So predominantly oaks. Some of the best places to see it in here are on the slopes above Ham Gate, to the north of Ham Cross Plantation, but across the park, there are a lot of some of the young roadside trees have been pollarded. The problem we found for the first 10, 15 years, they seem to grow fine. Last year, the squirrels seemed to latch onto them. So that was a problem for us. But there was this group, basically, pollarding happened for many, many centuries and then stopped in Victorian times. But the trees, of course, kept growing. And that's why we're faced with managing the stability of many of these big old lapsed pollard trees in the park and trying to keep them going. But there's effectively a 200-year gap. Now, that is not irrecoverable, but if you wind the clock forwards for 200 years, we need to be seeing pollarded trees coming forward. They don't fall, they won't become veterans for another 300 or 400 years, hopefully. But there is, at the moment, there is a lapse, if you like, in the continuity of pollarding in the park, and that's why we're very keen to reinstate that. So partly it's pollarding young trees, but also we are, some of the older trees, occasionally we will cut them back rather than fell them if we think that can contribute. So this is very much about continuity, very long-term continuity of habitat, which we're seeking to achieve.
Great. We're rapidly running out of time here now, actually, Simon. I'll just put one more too, which I partly know the answer to myself because I witnessed it. This is from John Peake, when digging a hole for a fence post, what happens if you encounter a root? Good question.
We move the fence posts.
Yes, I witnessed that in the
basically.
In that time lapse.
Or occasionally we dig up a grenade. That's always fun when we find those from sort of relics of wartime activity. But we have to check. There's lots of buried services in the park, so we have to be careful we don't dig up a gas main. But where we're working around veteran trees in particular, we are very careful to not damage the roots.
Right. Okay. I think, thank you, Simon. I think that's probably all. I'm looking at my clock here. It's coming up to noon. So I think we're going to have to call it a day there with the questions. So for those of you who have sent in questions unanswered, I'm sorry about that. We just don't have time to get to them all, but hopefully the presentations, particularly by Simon, have been, and with Gillian in absentia, have been very helpful and informative to you all. I've certainly learned an awful lot today. So I think I'd like to mock applause. Thanks for Simon. So if you'd like to join us at home, please give him a clap. Thank you very much indeed, Simon and Gillian.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
So, one of the points that was made in some of the questions actually is that I haven't introduced myself. So this is a bit backwards here, but I'm Richard Gray. I'm a trustee of the Friends, and I'm responsible mostly for conservation and making crazy films and things. Thanks everyone for joining us today, for sending in your questions. As I said, sorry we couldn't get to them. I just wanted to go through a few bits and pieces that the Friends are doing for the trees in Richmond Park. We have an active conservation team that do a lot to help trees with rhododendron clearance and clearing undergrowth in other places to encourage young trees coming along. Christopher Headley, who's a notable member of the Friends, has published over the last year with the help of Vivian Press, one of our trustees. They've published fantastic, remarkable trees, guided walks, self-guided walks. Now these are printed, which is a bit frustrating if you want to do one of these walks now, in that you can't get them from the visitor centre because it's closed, or online because our online shop's closed at the moment for obvious reasons. But you can actually, if you download GPX software, you can actually download those walks from our website. So if you're keen to do those. We also have the trees photography competition will be announced for spring very soon. And if you haven't seen any of the photos from the previous seasons, they're fabulous, they're on the website. And also Christopher, together with Vivian, has been doing the Tree of the Month. And there's fascinating information about each species, and lots of different species of trees on the website again. So a huge amount of information on that website, particularly about trees. So we're currently working on the next Zoom sessions. We have, in no particular order, roughly in order, amphibians, birds, bats, flowers and pollinators, all coming up in the next few months. I hope actually that we can do it in person, but it doesn't look like we will be able to. I think we'll have to continue with these Zoom presentations for a little while until we're all jabbed and safe. But you know, hopefully they'll keep you occupied during lockdown and during this dreadful pandemic. So I think that the big hand's just coming round towards the zero, so we'll close it here. Once again, a huge thanks to Simon, Xanthi and Roger. And remember, if you visit the park, please do tread lightly, treat the wildlife with respect, and of course, keep your social distance too. So thank you very much and enjoy your day. Goodbye.